Thank you very much, Andrea. I was joking with Andrea a little bit earlier this morning. I was thinking that a lot of the information I'm going to be presenting this afternoon is really out of her PhD dissertation, and I was questioning whether or not she should be presenting this as opposed to me, and maybe we could switch spots and I could be a moderator. But anyway, I really appreciated Dean's comments, and I really like this concept of caloric efficiency. And we need to be thinking about what we measure that makes an impact on our overall goal of improving profitability. And oftentimes when I have the opportunity to give presentations like this, I like to start off with a big picture view of, at least in my mind, what we try to accomplish as nutritionists, or at least what we should be trying to accomplish as we move into the future, and that is, much like anything else we do today, we have to do more with less. And I think a lot of this comes down to how do we improve caloric efficiency in pork production, and certainly lipids play a pretty big role in this. Just as a reference point, these are just some comparisons of some raw materials that we often use as energy sources in pig diets. And it's no surprise to, I think, any of us in the room that over the course of the last 7 to 10 years, there's been a 300 to 600% increase in cost of many of these raw materials. And if you couple that with the role that lipids play, not only as a very high energy source, but also a fairly expensive energy source, as Dean pointed out very well, they do play a number of roles, and I think John Patience is going to talk about this next, but we use them primarily as an energy source, but they have a lot of other applications in terms of improving palatability, pellet quality, reducing dust, and certainly they're a very important supplier of fat-soluble vitamins and some essential fatty acids. And I'm particularly interested in some of the work at NC State that Eric and Dean presented here a little earlier on the role of linoleic acid or essential fatty acids in reproduction. So there's no doubt that I think we have to improve caloric efficiency for a number of different reasons. Energy is the most expensive component of the diet. Lipids are the most expensive energy source. But two of the themes I want to challenge everybody to think about today, which I'm going to try to address and supply some supporting data, is number one, I think we have to do a better job of establishing good energy loading values to use in our feed formulation, because we are dealing with an increasing variety of different lipid sources in the fats and oils market. And in many cases, at least I don't have a lot of confidence in what those values should be. The second point is that once we get these fats and oils into the feed mill and into these systems, what are we doing to preserve the energy value and prevent it from going through peroxidation and some other things? And I'll show you what some of the possible negative impacts of lipid damage or lipid peroxidation can be. I borrowed this out of the National Pork Board Industry Productivity Report from a few years ago, and you can see very quickly on this graph that if we look at caloric efficiency, the pork industry hasn't made much progress. And I think in the future, as we think about increasing energy costs in our diets and so on, this is really where we need to be, and I want to focus a little bit on what we can do from a lipid point of view today. So nutritionists are no different than anybody else. We want predictability and consistency. One of our biggest challenges is managing variability. And we are trying to minimize the risk of both overfeeding and underfeeding energy or nutrients, because in either case, we don't capture full value. And the other part that I want to talk about is that we often don't think too much about relative to fats and oils is how are we preventing losses in metabolizable energy or net energy value in some of our fat tanks and different things that we're using in feed mills. And once the animal consumes some of these lipids, there's a third dimension that again doesn't often get thought about very much, and that is what happens to metabolic oxidative stress, and does that have implications in terms of pig health and performance in various production phases. To give you a little background, these are 5 general categories of fats and oils that are available in the lipid industry. I don't want to get into all these details other than to say that this portfolio of lipid products is becoming more diverse and more variable, and I think one of our challenges as nutritionists is to understand some of these key components that go into establishing what the value of some of these lipids are. I think one of the other challenges we have from a profitability and cost containment or cost management point of view is that the price that we pay for many of these fats and oils is not always, and maybe you could argue not ever, very closely related to its actual energy value. And we need to be thinking about how we relate standards that are used in the industry for marketing these products and how we as nutritionists value those or evaluate their quality going into pig feeds. Composition, as I mentioned earlier, is highly variable, and I would argue that the quality, and quality means different things to different people, but the quality is not well defined, certainly in terms of energy value, but probably more importantly in terms of its degree of peroxidation or susceptibility peroxidation, especially if it's stored at high temperatures in feed mills over time. And we're certainly seeing in some instances some question marks about animal fats versus vegetable oils from a biosecurity and virus transmission point of view, which has had some impact on the fats and oils market. Generally speaking, in the fats and oils industry, there are 4 general criteria that are used as trading standards. Titer, which is the relationship or the ratio of unsaturated to saturated fatty acids, free fatty acid content, the moisture insolubles and unsaponifiables, otherwise known as MIU content, and then some people get a little bit carried away with using color as an indicator of lipid quality. And if you notice that in general those trading standards don't talk much about energy value directly, there's not much here that gives us an indication about level of peroxidation, and as a result, I often argue that I think there's a big disconnect between lipid value and actual feeding value relative to what we have been using as measurements of lipid quality versus what we use or need to be using as nutritionists in terms of evaluating what their true energy values might be. And so specifically I'm looking at obviously metabolizable energy or net energy content. What is their susceptibility to peroxidation? And we have some predictive tests. How much peroxidation has occurred if we're buying a source that has gone through some kind of a heat process or other kinds of processes. And probably another important factor is evaluating what that fatty acid profile looks like, because that piece of the story has a big impact, along with several other measures, on what the overall energy value might be. So I think a lot of times we have to, as I sometimes tell our students, don't just answer the question the answers. And here I think is a situation where we need to think about, are we measuring the right things? And of the things that we are measuring, what are they truly telling us about lipid quality and energy value? I've listed here about 6 things that affect the ME content of lipids. Like Dean pointed out, age of pig. Certainly we know that this unsaturated to saturated fatty acid ratio makes a difference. Free fatty acid content, the chain length of the fatty acid, and the fatty acid position on the glycerol backbone are all factors that do play a pretty big role in this. And if anybody's interested in learning a lot more about some of these different factors, I'm not going to get into the details today, but Julian Wiseman has done a lot of work and made a career out of understanding these relationships not only in the pig, but also in the broiler. Here's just an example, and the point here is not to have you memorize all these numbers and relationships, but it's simply to illustrate that if you look at the different proportions of colors in these different bars of different, I've got 5 different lipids listed here, you'll notice that the proportion of some of the different colors varies quite a bit from one source to another. And each of those different subsets of those bars indicates a specific fatty acid or group of fatty acids that contribute or are found in those lipid sources. If you look at it another way, the iodine value, which is the ratio of unsaturated to saturated fats, can vary quite a bit from the vegetable oils being fairly high to some of the animal fats being somewhat lower, and it's that ratio that indicates or dictates what the ME content of some of these lipids are going to be. One of the things that I really appreciate about the new swine NRC table of feed ingredients is that in many cases, with the exception of fats and oils, we have an idea of how many samples went into some of the mean values that are presented, and we also have an indication of what the standard deviations are. But in the case of fats and oils, we essentially have just single mean values. And we know from many cases that these are not static numbers, and we can't rely on those exclusively in our feed formulations because we're giving up opportunities to capture full value. So regardless of whether we're talking about choice white grease, which is a common one here, we know that there's some variation around this average value. The question is how much? Certainly if we look at animal vegetable blends, which are also commonly used, they're going to rank a little bit lower in ME content compared to corn and soybean oil, but again we need to know something about variability, and that's, I think, a real challenge that we have as nutritionists and the feed industry to capture some of that information a little bit better. Very quickly, I want to just talk about some recent research that we've done with distillers corn oil. Some of this is moving into swine diets for a variety of reasons. It's a fairly competitive energy source. It's very abundant. Once the ethanol industry decided to start extracting this out of the co-products before making DDGS, but its free fatty acid content can vary quite a bit from less than 5% to 15%. Why is that important? Free fatty acid content directly impacts negatively the ME content. So as free fatty acids go up, ME content goes down. At least that's what previous research and a lot of body of work that Dr. Wiseman has shown in years past. And so one of my collaborators, Dr. Brian Kerr at USDA in Ames, Iowa, and I conducted a study where we collected 3 different distillers corn oil sources. You can see the free fatty acid content listed here, to ask the question, can we see that same kind of relationship with these sources of distillers corn oil? As kind of a positive control over here, we had refined corn oil. And then on the negative side, we asked a processor to manufacture a high free fatty acid, about a 94% free fatty acid corn oil. We fed it to pigs and we asked them, tell us what the ME content is. You'll notice that as we move from the lower free fatty acid to the 12.8% free fatty acid distillers corn oil, we got a significant drop in ME content. We expected that. But here's a 14% free fatty acid corn oil that wasn't different from these two. And the 94% free fatty acid corn oil had an ME content pretty similar to our refined corn oil. So again, going back to the comment I made earlier, this was a big surprise for us. Does that mean that there's something unique about distillers corn oil that's causing this unpredicted response in ME content? We're not sure. We're repeating this experiment using a different set of distillers corn oil sources, but it's causing us to ask the question, is that impact of free fatty acid content as big as we've been taught to believe? In the meantime, the best approach I think we have to trying to deal with this variability in ME content among sources is to use some of these equations that were derived from Julian Wiseman's group several years ago for young and old pigs. Basically, they're driven by free fatty acid content and the unsaturated to saturated fatty acid ratio in various lipids, and it will give us at least a ballpark estimate instead of a static average value to use if we're trying to account for some of that variability. I want to move on to the next part of this story, and that is focus more on some of the recent research we've been working on, and that's asking the question, does lipid damage or lipid peroxidation, does it matter? Does it matter in terms of pig health and performance? And Andrea did a nice job putting this whole composite together about a year ago, but I think the important thing to realize here is that lipid peroxidation occurs at several different levels. Many of you that are familiar with antioxidant products that are available in the industry think only about applying them at the ingredient level or perhaps the entire diet level without necessarily thinking about, well, maybe there's some peroxidation that occurs in the GI tract, and maybe once some of these lipids get absorbed, we have some other issues related to metabolic oxidation that we need to pay attention to. And so the point here is that it does occur at several different levels. Lipid peroxidation has only negative effects at each level. And so our quest as nutritionists is to understand this process better and think about what can we do to stimulate or preserve endogenous antioxidants, or do we need to add supplemental antioxidants such as vitamin E or other things to help prevent some of the negative effects of peroxidation from occurring. Kemin Industries summarized over 500 lipid samples, and just to give you an idea of two measures of lipid peroxidation, peroxide value and TBA, you'll note for some of these common lipid sources that there's quite a range in peroxidation going into feed mills, not only here in the U.S. but around the world, which raises the question, should we be concerned about this from a pig health and performance point of view? So one of the things that Andrea did, which I thought was very helpful in allowing us to kind of structure how we were to proceed with some of our lipid peroxidation work in pigs, is that she summarized data from 17 studies that only focused on comparing unperoxidized versus peroxidized lipids of different sources. Most of them were soybean oil, but there were some others. And all the diets in those comparisons were isocaloric, so we were comparing on an equal calorie or at least calculated calorie basis. And the reported peroxidation indicators were peroxide value and malondialdehyde, which picks up some of the secondary oxidation products, growth performance, and some measures of metabolic oxidative stress, such as T-bars and alpha-tocopherol concentration. So the results from this showed that on average, or maybe even more than average, there was about 11% reduction in growth rate. And notice that in some of these studies, there was even a more dramatic reduction in growth rate when feeding peroxidized lipids to growing finishing pigs compared to feeding the unoxidized source. From a feed intake point of view, about a 7.5% reduction on average. And for gain efficiency, about a 4.3% reduction. So if you think about lipid quality, this should get some of your attention, because if we're having this kind of a dramatic impact on growth performance, on average, if we have some really poor lipid quality that's sitting in fat tanks that haven't been cleaned out in feed mills for a long time, the potential for reduction in performance could be much greater. From a metabolic oxidation point of view, alpha-tocopherol concentrations in serum on average dropped about 46% compared to controls. So if we think about vitamin supplementation or vitamin needs relative to feeding peroxidized lipids, this should enter into our thought process. And using serum T-bars as an indicator of the presence of peroxidized products metabolically, those increased by about 20%, indicating that, yeah, we not only see a reduction in performance, but there are some negative consequences relative to metabolic oxidative status. One of the things that Dr. Kerr and I are learning in this quest to figure out this complex area of lipid quality is that it all comes down to what we measure. And in the case of measuring peroxidation, there are many different tests that can be used, but none of them independently answers all the questions or gives us a clear picture. And this is an example of a traditional measure of peroxide value, and as we tried to correlate peroxide value of the diet with the percentage change in average daily gain compared to the controls, the correlation is very poor. Peroxide value may have some value in combination with a few other measures, but certainly by an independent single measure itself doesn't tell us the whole story. T-bars, thiobarbituric acid reactive substances, common measure also used to determine peroxidation in feeds and feed ingredients, is correlated much better with average daily gain, but again, it's not a perfect predictor. So I've got a few minutes left here. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and just point out that it's the long-chain fatty acids, the linoleic and the linolenic acids that are present in high concentrations in our soybean oils and corn oils that we're most concerned about relative to peroxidation. And peroxidation occurs essentially in a three-stage process from initiation to propagation to termination. And along those stages, we have a lot of different peroxidation products that are produced, and they also are decomposed. And one of the challenges that we have measuring things like peroxide value or T-bars for aldehydes is that these curves follow a bell shape. And so we have more peroxidized lipid on this stage of peroxidation than we do at this stage of peroxidation, but we may have equivalent analytical values to work with. And that's one of the reasons why we need to use multiple measures of peroxidation in order to get a better assessment of where a particular lipid might be along this spectrum of peroxidation. Color is not a good indicator, despite what many people in the industry believe. These are some samples of corn oil and canola oil that Brian heated over the course of time for a couple of our experiments, and you'll notice that the color gradually darkens and then begins to lighten again. And so at the end of the peroxidation period, it doesn't look much different than it did before. Many people ask the question, why does it darken? Well, we think that's where the production of a lot of these volatile peroxidation products are occurring. They get released into the air, and we're not capturing those in some of the measurements that we're using for peroxidation. So color is not a good indicator of lipid quality. Here's a long list of the indicator tests that we have available to use. Some of these are more commonly available in commercial laboratories than others. We've been focusing on the three highlighted here in blue as a combination to give us an indication of the initiation peroxidation products with peroxide value, T-bars to measure some of the aldehydes, and anisodine value as a third measure of some of those secondary peroxides. We don't know anything about the tertiary compounds, but certainly they raise some questions about what their role may be in metabolic oxidative stress. If we want to predict how susceptible a lipid is, we believe that the oil stability index is probably our better, more accurate method. These are some data from a study conducted by Pai Lu, a former PhD student of ours, heating 4 different lipids, corn oil, canola oil, poultry fat, and beef tallow at 96 degrees for 72 hours or 185 degrees for 7 hours. The point of this slide is to demonstrate that depending on the length of, or the temperature and the length of time of heating, you get different answers for the same lipids using some of these lipid peroxidation tests. So we need to be thoughtful in choosing the right test relative to the fatty acid profile of some of the lipids that we're using, because rate and amount of peroxidation does vary by heating conditions and the fatty acid composition of the lipids. I put this in as a reminder, and I've made this comment a couple times already. One of the things that we have to be thinking about, I think more than ever before in feed mills, is are we taking care of our fats and oils good enough, or are we doing a good enough job? And anybody that's had any experience knows that oftentimes sludge accumulates at the bottom of some of these fat and oil tanks, and that stuff can't be good. It probably accelerates peroxidation, And in many cases, I think some of that stuff rarely gets cleaned out as new batches get added. And so to take a look at the impact of, or at least ask the question, should we be adding antioxidants to prevent peroxidation in a couple of our common ingredients, which are distillers grains and distillers corn oil. Distillers grains ranging in fat content and distillers corn oil slightly varying in MIU content. We added a Kemin antioxidant product called Rendox CQ, which is TBHQ as the active ingredient, and a Novus product called Santoquin, which has the combination of ethoxyquin and TBHQ, simply to measure what happens, or are these antioxidants effective in preventing peroxidation over the course of a 28-day storage period when we had these ingredients in a controlled environmental chamber at 38 degrees C. And notice that regardless of whether we talk about the corn oil or the distillers grains, yes, we did create peroxidation over the course of time using 3 of our common peroxidation measures. And when we compare the high versus the reduced oil distillers grains, oil content does make a difference. Less oil, there's less to peroxidize, and we saw less peroxide value in T-bars in the case of distillers grains. And the higher MIU corn oil had more peroxidation compared to the lower MIU corn oil. When we added the antioxidants, Rendox in the blue and Santoquin in the red, basically they reduced peroxidation under these conditions by about 50%. So the question that we're asking is that amount of peroxidation enough to negatively affect pig growth performance to justify the cost of adding these antioxidants from a calorie preservation point of view? And so I think we're just at the beginning stages of trying to come up with some answers to some of these, what I think are some very important questions related to caloric efficiency. The last part I'm going to skip quickly here. The last experiment, which was part of Andrea's PhD work, asked the question, if we put together a blend of unoxidized and peroxidized corn oil at different concentrations in a nursery pig diet, can we demonstrate, again, like her literature review showed, that it does have negative effects on growth performance? And in fact, there was about an 8% reduction, linear reduction, in average daily gain as the percentage or the amount of peroxidized corn oil increased in the diet. There was no effect on feed intake, and feed conversion, much like that overall summary showed, about a 4% reduction in gain to feed. From a caloric efficiency point of view, it decreased by about 2.5 to 4% as we had more amounts of peroxidized corn oil in these diets. So this is a real biological response. It does have negative consequences in terms of pig performance and potentially health. And I think it's one of the reasons why we need to pay a little bit more attention to maintaining fat quality in our feed manufacturing systems. Alpha tocopherol in the serum cubically declined, which is not a good thing, of course. Our selenium levels in the serum also declined over the course of time, and T-bars as an indicator of metabolic oxidative stress increased. So we have a lot of questions. This is a complex area. We have to be thinking about refining the things that we measure. We're asking questions about, are there threshold levels of peroxidation that we have to be focused on to predict or avoid reductions in performance? Are there any long-term consequences of metabolic oxidation stress or feeding these lipids over time? And we're hoping to do some more work looking at various supplemental antioxidants and what those effects might have, not only in terms of preserving lipid quality in feeds, but also relative to metabolic oxidative stress.